Now,
1 in 3 women experience abuse from their partners in their lifetime. So if you think that domestic violence doesn't affect you, think again.
The annual Women's Refuge Conference happened over the weekend, and here now to discuss are Professor Michael Johnson and Marai Larasi in Wellington. And here in our studio is Anton. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming in. How successful was the conference over the weekend?
I thought it was a great conference. There were about over 200 people there. And, you know, just seeing the strength of the women's refuge movement. And also for me what was quite interesting was a really solid representation of men, which is really good to see men involved in the prevention of violence towards women.
Can we just start, before we go any further, with each of you, just giving us a brief rundown of your sort of field of expertise, if you like, Anton?
Well, I'm Executive Director of Refuge Oct, which is a Māori child abuse prevention program. My specific area of expertise and interest is in the maltreatment of Māori children.
OK.
Have you looked at preventing that?
Well, that's primarily what we're concerned with. We know that rates of Māori child abuse are higher than for other groups. So around half the children who are killed as a result of abuse in New Zealand are Māori children. There's a lot of debate about whether that violence is real or whether people are just more likely to report Māori child abuse. I think it's really hard to argue with that hard data of the deaths.
There's been some very high-profile and disturbing cases as well. I'm thinking near Glassy. Was that a case that galvanised you guys to try and do something about this?
Well, certainly that was the start of our organisation. So in 2007, following the death of Near Glassy, I got together with my uncle, Dr. Honeka, and we convened a summit on Māori child abuse, developed a plan to eliminate Māori child abuse, and that saw the establishment of Refuge. So we've now been going for 5 years.
What's that plan?
Well, there's three aspects of our work: advocacy, research and communications. Advocacy, we're focused on working with politicians and policymakers to make changes in favour of Māori children. In terms of research, we've looked at the history of Māori parenting. What we found was that before we were colonised, we had non-violent parenting was the modus operandi. We've also have another research project underway where we're interviewing a small sample of Māori teenagers, boys and girls, to see how they have been impacted by childhood abuse. And communications, we run workshops around the country for providers. We have a radio show on Iwi Radio, and we develop resources for families and for providers.
Michael, what is your current area of expertise, and what are you researching?
Yeah, I do research on domestic violence, in particular in distinguishing among types of intimate partner violence.
Why did you choose to study in that area?
It's a serious social problem, social justice issue, a human rights issue.
Can you give me a rundown on some of the different types that you've sort of ascertained are there, and how they're implemented and how they're used?
One type involves a pattern of coercive controlling violence in which one partner uses violence and other intimidating and coercive control tactics to try to take complete control over his partner. And this is most of what you see in the courts, in the hospitals, and in the shelters. And this is perpetrated almost entirely by men. The second major type involves couples that have fights. They have arguments that escalate to violence. Violence perpetrated by either the man or the woman. But even in cases of situational couple violence, the men's violence has much more serious consequences than the women's violence. More likely to injure, more likely to intimidate and create fear, and more likely to have negative psychological consequences.
The situational couple violence, is that men and women perpetrating?
That is men and women, and when you see people cite statistics when they argue that women are as violent as men in intimate relationships, those statistics are about that kind of violence. And although both men and women perpetrate that kind of situational violence, the men's violence has a much more severe impact.
What has your research told you about stopping this, about preventing it, about it not getting out of hand?
Well, the first thing, of course, is to hold people accountable for their violence in the justice system. Violence is violence in some respects, and people have to be held accountable. But then you want to intervene with perpetrators to try to get them to stop their violence, and you need a differentiated approach that deals with these two types differently. But also you need to provide support for victims, particularly in the coercive controlling violence. Women are entrapped in those kinds of relationships. It's very hard to leave a relationship like that safely. You're dealing with a violent man who often has threatened to do more violence if you try to leave. And so programs like Women's Refuge are important.
See, by the time the justice system gets involved, though, Professor, it's too late. So what type of people can we identify as possibly being prone to this or at risk from this and possibly step in there and help before it gets to that point?
Well, I think primary prevention is important. That we need programs in our schools, we need programs in the media that focus on issues of equality and respect in relationships, so that boys and men don't get the feeling that they have a right to control their partners.
If you've been a child in an abusive relationship like that, are you more prone to then become an offender?
Yes, the research does indicate that that increases the probability, but it's important to know that most children who grow up in abusive families don't grow up to be abusers themselves. Although the probability is higher that they'll be abusive, still the vast majority of them don't grow up to be abusers.
Marai, what is your area of expertise? What are you specialising in?
So I work generally around violence against women and girls, but over the last few years my focus has been primarily around black, minority, ethnic and refugee communities, looking at what are the commonalities and what are the differences. So, for example, forced marriage disproportionately affects women from particular communities. Female genital mutilation disproportionately affects girls from particular communities. And so for us, there's something about understanding what are the specifics in terms of those communities. How does help seeking differ? What does it mean in terms of access to things like refuge provision? And are there specific risks associated with particular communities?
And presumably there are specific risks. How much is cultural background and identity a factor in domestic violence?
Sure. So one of the things we're aware of is with particular communities, sometimes a woman is fleeing not just a violent partner, but you know, kind of other relatives, sometimes community members, community leaders, and that can present real challenges in terms of accessing safety. So for you to support that woman, you need to understand that she's not just fleeing her partner, that actually her father-in-law might also be chasing her, that, you know, somebody who is, for all intents and purposes, a respected member of the community, for example, a doctor, might not be a safe person for that woman to disclose to. So this, you know, for us, the specifics around that need to be understood by all agencies, including criminal justice agencies. So a police officer attending the scene might need to know, actually, you know, it's not good for me to go and talk to this woman's uncle. Or it might not be good for me to go and talk to her mother-in-law, because those people might also be you know, presenting a risk.
It's a question open to all of you. What would be your advice for women out there watching this programme who are in an abusive relationship? What should they do?
Can I just focus on children, which we touched on very briefly, but what we do know about the impact of domestic violence on children, who are often seen as secondary victims of domestic violence, is that witnessing violence and being around that type of family violence has the same impact on children as being physically, sexually or emotionally abused. So we know that those children are more likely to be depressed and unhappy. It impacts on their brain development, so they're more likely to be developmentally delayed and have problems at school, and are likely to have problems with sleeping and eating disorders. So just wanted to focus on, and I think it's really important that when we talk about domestic violence, that we see children, even if they're not being hit, as primary victims.
Victim. Yeah, absolutely. We're out of time.
We are, unfortunately, but I'd like to thank you all for giving us your time today. If you or someone you know are worried about domestic violence, please call 0800 Refuge. That's 0800 733 843, or visit womensrefuge.org.nz. All the links are available on our website.
Stick around. Nikki Loveridge has your makeup guide for summer next.